You can support me by turning on notifications, subscribing to my channel, and liking the video. Waiting for your comments. What's behind the locked door? The night I returned to my childhood home, a bitter wind swept through the empty streets, carrying the scent of damp earth and half-buried memories. My hometown had always been quiet, but on this particular evening, the stillness clung to every corner like a shadow. The old cobblestone roads glistened under the faint glow of antique street lamps, and the silhouettes of once familiar houses seemed warped and uninviting. When I first stepped off the bus, the door wheezing shut behind me, I felt a chill run down my spine, though the autumn air was mild. It was as though the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My destination. The long-abandoned family estate on the far side of town, an ancestral house that I had not stepped foot in for nearly a decade. There, behind an old door that never opened, lay the secrets of my past, beckoning me closer despite every instinct to turn away. The house itself sat perched at the end of a winding gravel road, half concealed by towering oak trees that threatened to consume it with their sprawling branches. By daylight, perhaps it would have been nothing more than a forgotten relic of times gone by. At night, however, it looked like a jagged silhouette carved out of the darkness. A single flickering porch light, never replaced, never maintained, cast shifting shadows across the rotting wooden boards. As I approached, my footsteps echoed with a hollow timbre, each crunch of gravel under my boots as loud as gunfire in the hush. Even from a distance, I could see that the windows were grimy and web-strewn, their broken panes reminiscent of gaping mouths. I paused at the threshold. There was a heaviness in the atmosphere, a suffocating weight pressing down on me, warning me that crossing this threshold would be more than just stepping back in time. I recall my parents' hushed conversations about an ancient family secret, or how one particular door in the house was always kept locked. As a child, I used to stand in front of that locked door, ear pressed against the wood, imagining I could hear faint scratching noises on the other side. My mother would gently steer me away, muttering it was just an old storage room filled with dusty antiques. But even then, I sensed there was something else behind that door, something that breathed and waited. Gathering what little courage I had, I inserted the antique key into the rusted lock of the main entrance. A reluctant groan reverberated through the house as the door finally swung open, revealing a grand foyer bathed in gloom. The dusty air smelled of mildew and disuse. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the stale darkness, illuminating draped furniture and peeling wallpaper. Each piece of furniture seemed to huddle under its sheet, as though trying to hide from prying eyes. The silence pressed close around me, and every step I took left footprints in the thick layer of dust. It felt as though the house had slumbered a century, waiting for someone to stir it awake. Memories tumbled back in fragments. The sound of my mother's laughter in the living room, the aroma of fresh bread wafting from the kitchen, the echo of my father's stern voice telling me never to wander the house at night. The corridor that led deeper into the mansion felt longer than I remembered, as if the architecture itself had shifted in my absence. Eventually, I reached the winding staircase, exactly as I remembered. Each step creaked in protest under my weight. The hall overhead branched into multiple doors, but I only cared about one, the locked door at the very end of the corridor. As a child, that door had dominated my nightmares. I recall countless nights trembling in bed, imagining that I heard footsteps pacing behind it, or quiet tapping that might have been fingernails scraping the wood. My father used to store the keys to all the house's doors in his study, but not once had I seen the key that unlocked the mysterious door at the corridor's end. Back then, I asked him about it frequently. "What's behind that door, Papa? Why is it always locked?" He'd hush me up, sometimes with a forced smile, sometimes with a stern warning. "Don't ask about things better left alone," he'd say. Or, "It's not safe for you in there." When I reached the corridor now, I was stunned to find that door still there, fully intact, seemingly untouched by time and decay. Even the rest of the house was riddled with cracks and peeling paint, but that ancient wooden panel seemed strangely preserved, almost pristine. A single brass knob adorned it, fiercely shiny amidst the surrounding dust, as though recently polished. An eerie glow seemed to cling to the edges of the frame, as if the door itself breathed. My heart thundered in my chest, and my hands felt clammy around the flashlight. Pacing closer, I realized with a start that the door handle had an intricate set of carved symbols. They appeared to be whorls or runes, reminiscent of some archaic language. How was that possible? My father had never been one for superstitions or cryptic carvings. Where had these symbols come from? On a trembling whim, I lifted my flashlight to examine them more carefully. The runes were carved so shallowly into the brass that they were almost invisible in normal light. But in the narrow beam of my flashlight they shimmered. Goosebumps ran up my arms. My mind conjured images of hidden cults, forbidden knowledge, and family curses whispered behind locked doors. A sudden sense of presence washed over me. It felt like the house was listening. The air around me had grown colder. I could practically see my breath. For a moment, I debated turning around, leaving everything behind and never coming back. Yet curiosity and a strange pull from that door compelled me onward. I rummaged through my pockets and found a ring of old house, keys I'd taken from my father's study. Most of them were mundane bedroom keys, basement keys, but one key stood out. An ornate skeleton key with an odd shape. It seemed to pulse in my hand, warm to the touch, a direct contrast to the cold that enveloped me. Without fully understanding why, I knew that key belonged to this door. Steadying my breath, I slipped the key into the lock. It clicked in a smooth, almost welcoming way, as if it had been waiting for precisely this moment. I froze, anticipating some resistance, but none came. The knob turned easily. A rush of stale air hit me as the door swung open into the darkness beyond. Peering inside, my flashlight revealed a small hallway leading downward, a flight of stone steps that spiraled into an unlit subterranean chamber. My parents had never mentioned a basement here, and I was certain I'd never seen any reference to it in the architectural plans. Yet here it was, beckoning me into the unknown. I took the steps slowly, one foot after another. The air was damp and smelled of earth, yet there was a subtle, foul undercurrent, like decaying leaves or rotting meat. My heartbeat throbbed in my ears. The flashlight beam danced across stone walls, revealing carved symbols matching those I'd seen on the doorknob. Occasionally, I spotted an ancient tapestry or a battered wooden crate, but most disturbingly, the shapes on the walls depicted scenes of darkness, silhouettes of hooded figures in a circle, a monstrous entity with elongated limbs, and what looked like a series of swirling lines that formed labyrinthine patterns. One tapestry caught my eye in particular. It depicted a robed figure standing before a large door, perhaps the very same door I had just unlocked. In the tapestry, the figure carried a staff, from which emanated jagged lines of light. Surrounding him were smaller silhouettes, seeming to cower or worship. The sense of dread that coursed through me was almost unbearable. The deeper I descended, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Yet I pressed on, determined to unearth whatever secret my family had so carefully locked away. At last, the stairway ended in a spacious underground chamber. My flashlight revealed a vaulted ceiling and walls lined with more of those strange runes. At the center of the chamber lay a large stone table reminiscent of some archaic altar. On the table was an old leather-bound book, its cover cracked and darkened with age. A thick layer of dust coated its surface, but the faint glow of my flashlight stirred motes in the stagnant air, making the space feel alive with dancing particles. I hesitated, then stepped forward. Each move felt like wading through invisible resistance, as though unseen hands were pressing against me. When I reached the table, my fingertips lightly brushed the surface of the book, leaving clear streaks in the dust. The sound of a soft whisper reached my ears. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the corners of the chamber, but saw no one. My pulse pounded in my throat. Could it be the wind? But there was no wind this far underground. Could it be my imagination? The tension in my shoulders told me otherwise. Carefully, I opened the book's cover. The first pages contained more of those runic symbols, drawn in ink so dark it appeared almost black-blue. Page after page featured diagrams and cryptic text. My eyes struggled to make sense of it, but it was written in a language I couldn't identify. Occasionally, I recognized faint references in Latin script, words like devour, boundary, and release scattered among the alien characters. As I flipped through the tome, time felt distorted. It was as though the world above had ceased to exist. Then, on one particular page near the middle, a phrase in my mother tongue appeared, scrawled across a rough sketch of the same door from upstairs. It read, "Do not break the seal." My breath caught. That door had been locked for a reason. The rest of the text was indecipherable, but I gleaned a sense of warning. A wave of dread came over me. Had I opened something that was never meant to be opened? A scraping noise from behind made me jump. It was as if nails or claws raked across the stone floor. Slowly, I raised my flashlight, shining it toward the far end of the chamber. The beam fell upon a shadowy figure, so dark and shapeless that it appeared to absorb the light. My throat tightened. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of my mind, a swirl of dust. But then it moved, a slow, purposeful shift, as if it were turning to face me. My heart hammered so fiercely, I thought it would burst. Instinct demanded I run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The shape began to glide closer, soundlessly except for that faint scraping, an almost primal clicking. Clutching the old book to my chest, I stumbled back. My flashlight trembled in my grip. The figure was tall, its edges blurry, like a living shadow contorting. In my peripheral vision, the carved runes on the walls and the ancient tapestries seemed to glow faintly. The presence advanced another step, and I realized with dawning horror that this might be the entity my family had somehow sealed away. "Stop," I heard myself say, though I wasn't sure if my words reached it. My voice echoed hollow and small. The figure paused, tilting what I presumed was its head. A new wave of fear crashed over me as an unintelligible whisper filled the chamber. It was as though multiple voices spoke at once, echoing, layering on top of each other. My mind scrambled to form coherent thoughts, but panic overrode reason. I wanted to drop the book and flee, but a cold force squeezed my chest, making each breath a struggle. Suddenly, the entity lunged forward, bridging half the distance in an instant. I stumbled and nearly dropped the flashlight. My beam flickered across its form, revealing hints of an elongated limb or perhaps an inhuman face. Instinct roared in my veins. I wrenched myself free from the paralyzing terror, turned, and dashed back toward the stone steps. Behind me, the scraping sound grew louder, more frantic, as though the figure chased me with savage urgency. Every fiber of my being propelled me upward. The swirling carvings on the walls glowed in the corner of my vision, pulsing with each frantic beat of my heart. I could feel its presence just behind me, a suffocating darkness that threatened to drag me under. My lungs burned from exertion, and my limbs shook, but adrenaline forced me to keep climbing. Eventually, I reached the top of the staircase, bursting into the corridor. I whipped around, slamming the door shut and turning the key in the lock. A deafening bang rattled the wood from the other side, as though powerful hands or claws tried to break through. The entire doorframe shuddered. I half expected it to splinter, but by some miracle it held. Fumbling with shaking hands, I pulled the old skeleton key out of the lock. The door no longer glowed or felt warm. Instead, it emanated a coldness that sent pins and needles along my skin. Another thunderous impact rattled the door from the inside, followed by an otherworldly howl, like wind rushing through hollow caverns but layered with an agonized wail. Terror rooted me in place, but I forced myself to think. The book had said, "Do not break the seal." Maybe locking the door again could keep that thing sealed away. In a blind haze, I scrambled for my father's study, searching for anything that might help me. Dust choked the air. Every piece of furniture was covered in a thick sheet. My flashlight illuminated old shelves filled with notebooks, diaries, and documents. I found one tattered journal that contained references to a dark presence and ritual binding. My father's handwriting scrawled frantic warnings across the yellowed pages. The door must remain locked at all costs. Our family promised to keep it sealed. The key must never be used. Rivulets of guilt and confusion warred within me. If only I'd known. If only I hadn't opened it. A loud crash from the corridor made me jump. The door was still closed, but it sounded as if cracks were starting to form in the wood. I clutched the journal, flipping pages for some answer. My father had scribbled a final note at the back. When the key is turned once more, the seal grows weak. Speak the incantation in the old tongue to reinforce it. My heart pounded. I stared at the strange scribbles on the page, a short verse in that same runic language. Presumably the incantation needed to keep the entity confined. But could I pronounce it properly? Did I even have time? Gripping the flashlight, the journal, and the skeleton key, I sprinted back into the corridor. The door now bore deep gouges, as though from massive claws. Shallow cracks spiderwebbed across its surface. A dreadful moan resonated from inside, and I could almost see a black haze seeping through the splits in the wood. Fighting the impulse to flee, I knelt before the door, placed the key into the lock from the outside, and tried to recall what I'd read in the journal. My mouth was dry, and my voice shaky, but I began to utter the runic incantation as best I could, stumbling over unfamiliar syllables. At first, nothing happened. Another jarring blow smashed into the door, nearly knocking me backward. My vision blurred with fear, but I pressed on, repeating the words. Then, faintly, the carvings around the door handle glimmered. The howling from within turned to a keening shriek, laced with fury. I repeated the incantation, louder, more confident this time. The glimmer spread to the cracks in the wood, slowly knitting them shut. That invisible darkness or presence roiled just behind the barrier, but it no longer banged in force. Instead, it roared in frustration, a hollow, echoing sound. The final lines of the incantation escaped my lips, and the door sealed itself once more. Silence fell. My breath came in ragged gasps. The door, though battered, now looked secure. No more cracks, no more black haze. I carefully turned the key again, removing it from the lock, and felt an odd surge of relief course through me. The corridor was still and quiet, the only sound my hammering heartbeat. Whatever was behind that door had been locked away once more, as my ancestors had done who knows how many years ago. Slowly, I rose to my feet, wiping cold sweat from my brow. My entire body trembled. My father's warning was painfully clear now. The door was never meant to be opened. The family secret was not some trivial relic or random piece of junk, but a malevolent force best left forgotten. I closed my eyes, letting out a shaky exhale. Outside, the night remained deep and silent. My flashlight beam cast trembling shadows across the hall. Although the immediate danger seemed past, the memory of that unholy presence would haunt me forever. Stepping back from the door, I realized I had a choice: remain in this cursed house or walk away for good. My father's journal indicated that the house needed someone to stand guard, someone to ensure the lock stayed unbroken. But could I bear that duty? In the end, I pressed my ear to the door. Nothing stirred beyond. Even so, I could sense its hunger, that primal malevolence waiting for the faintest opportunity. I ran my fingers over the runes on the doorknob, pondering the centuries of secrets that had led us here. Then, with a heavy heart, I turned away. I'd find a way to keep the property locked up forever, or perhaps see to its destruction, if that was possible, without unleashing whatever prowled beyond. All I knew was that the question that had once fueled my curiosity had at last been answered, and it was an answer I would trade anything to forget.